My last question, what does the US public do about big tech if it wants to take on some of these issues, income inequality, regional inequality, global imperial overreach, etc.? A few proposals and which, somebody can execute on. What would you suggest?
Yeah, I wouldn't even say it's just the US public. I mean, anyone in the world can do something about it. And one of the remarkable things for me in reporting stories is people who felt like they had the least amount of agency in the world were actually the ones that put up the most aggressive fights and actually started gaining ground on these companies in taking resources from them. So I talk about Chilean water activists who pushed back against a Google data center project for so long that they've stalled that project now for 5 years. And they forced Google to come to the table and the Chilean government to come to the table. And now these residents are invited to comment every time there's a data center development proposal, which they then said it's not the end of the fight. Like, they still have to be vigilant, and at any moment, if they blink, something could happen. But anyone in the world, I think, has an active role to play in shaping the AI development trajectory. And the way that I think about it is the full supply chain of AI development. You have a bunch of resources that these companies need to develop their technologies: data, land, energy, water. And then you have a bunch of spaces that these companies need access to deploy their technologies: schools, hospitals, offices, government agencies. All of these resources and all of these spaces are actually places of democratic contestation. They're collectively owned. They're publicly owned. So we're already seeing artists and writers that are suing these companies saying, no, you cannot take our intellectual property. And that is them reclaiming ownership over a critical resource that these companies need. We're seeing people start exercising their data privacy rights. I mean, one of my favorite things about visiting the UK and EU as an American that has no federal data privacy law to protect me is to reject those cookies every single web page that I encounter. That is me reclaiming ownership over my data and not allowing those companies to then feed that into their models. We're seeing, just like the Chilean water activists, hundreds of communities now rising up and pushing back against data center development. We're seeing teachers and students escalate a public debate around, do we actually want AI in our schools? And if so, under what terms? And many schools are now setting up governance committees to determine what their AI policy is, so that ultimately AI can facilitate more curiosity and more critical thinking instead of just eroding it all away. The same thing, I'm sure, wherever your audience is sitting right now, if they work for a company, that company is for sure discussing their AI policy. Put yourself on that committee for drafting that policy. Make sure that all the stakeholders in that office are at that table actively discussing when and under what conditions you would accept AI, and from which vendors as well. Because again, not all AI models are created equal. So do your research on which AI technologies you want to use and which companies are providing them. And I think if everyone can actually actively play a role in every single part of the supply chain that they interface with, which is quite a lot. Most people interface with the data part. Many people will now have data centers popping up in a community near them. Everyone goes to school at some point. Everyone works in some kind of office or community at some point. If we do all of this pushback 100,000 times fold and democratically contest every stage of this AI development and deployment pipeline, I am very optimistic that we will reverse the imperial conquest of these companies and move towards a much more broadly beneficial trajectory for AI development.
Yeah, we've had big tech social media for the last 15, 20 years. And I suppose the question is the same set of patterns going to apply to this stuff? And I think when you speak to someone like Jonathan Haidt, when he talks about young people and their consumption now of social media and mobile telephones, etc., his real worry is AI.
Yeah.
And if there is this laissez-faire attitude from policymakers and also, let's be honest, from civil society that there was over the last 15, 20 years, I mean, he's terrified about the implications. So it's interesting to see that there's congruence between what you're saying, what Jonathan Haidt's saying. Can I ask you one more question?
Yeah.
Have you ever read Dune by Frank Herbert?
I've watched the movie and it's sitting on my bedside table to actually read the original. And I'm so glad that you asked me this, because this is an analogy that I use all the time now to describe the AI world.
Yeah. Butlerian jihad.
So one of the things that was so shocking to me, because we already talked about this like quasi-religious fervor within the AI community, and I was interviewing people who, one of the people that their voice was quivering when they were telling me about the profound cataclysmic changes on the horizon. Like, these are very visceral reactions. These are true believers. And Dune strikes me as a really good analogy for understanding this ecosystem, because Paul Atreides' mom in the story, she creates this myth to help position Paul as a supreme leader and to ultimately control the population. And the people who encounter this myth, they don't know that it's a creation, so they're just true believers. And at some point, Paul gets so wrapped up in this own mythology that he starts to forget that it was originally a creation. And this is essentially what I felt like I was seeing with my interviews of people in the AI world, because I had the opportunity to start interviewing people starting all the way back in 2019. I interviewed some people who, for back then and for the book, to just map out their trajectory. And there were non-believers back then that are true believers now. Like, if they were able to stay long enough at that company, they all in the end become true believers in this AGI religion. And so there's this vortex of, it's like a black hole, ideological black hole. I don't know how to explain it, but people, when they swim too long in the water, it just becomes them.
So what you're saying is Sam Altman is the Lisan al-Gaib. That's the character. And Paul Graham maybe was the
it would seem,
the mother.
It would seem like that would be the most appropriate character to assign to him, yeah.
Wow. This has been fabulous. And I have to say, honestly, the book is really, really exceptional. Empire of AI. I read it so much that I think my daughter actually ripped it off. But anyway, it is a sensational book, sensational journalism, fantastic journalist. We don't have enough of those in the world.